The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
Welcome to Squawk Box Europe. I'm Karen Cho with Ben Boulos. These are your headlines. Iran raises the price for reopening the Strait of Hormuz, demanding major concessions, including US compensation, and complicating President Trump's efforts to find an exit from the conflict.
Tensions in the region flare up once again, with Yemen's Houthi rebels striking a Saudi oil refinery days after Riyadh signs a mutual defense pact with Turkey and Pakistan. Greg Abel splashes the cash, putting almost $20 billion to work at Berkshire Hathaway in the second quarter, including a $10 billion investment in Alphabet.
The latest today, Iran says a deal with Oman around transit through the Strait of Hormuz is close, but tied the reopening of the waterway to conditions including US compensation and an end to sanctions. Traffic through Hormuz remains at low levels, with the UAE over the weekend condemning what it called a hostile Iranian attack, targeting an ADNOC-affiliated tanker transiting through the strait. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said an agreement with Oman would not necessarily see the Strait of Hormuz reopened.
Our negotiations with Oman concern the establishment of new maritime routes through the Strait of Hormuz. These talks have progressed well, and I can say that we are in the final stages. The old routes will be replaced with new ones. Experts are currently working on the maps. This, however, does not mean that the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened. An agreement on the routes may be reached, but reopening the Strait of Hormuz depends on a separate set of conditions being met, and those conditions are being conveyed through intermediaries.
There's no doubt Iran has stolen the narrative here, really taking the charge in terms of the dynamics and the optics. It felt as though the president had hoped that there was some sort of negotiation away from another attack on Iran, that this would lead to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, potentially down the track, maybe nuclear talks would be back on the table. But at this point, the Iranians are making it so difficult for the Strait of Hormuz to remain open. It feels as though that is just occupying all of the time, all of the narrative. So it's making it incredibly difficult for the Americans to get anything that they want out of this situation. So now talk of compensation from the Iranian side just to get the strait open is again just making it a high-priced sort of outcome, trying to achieve any stability on this vital oil waterway.
Yeah, and I think the other big uncertainty is what is the status of the talks? Not only what is the status of the demands and the expectations of each side, which seem to keep shifting from day to day, from week to week, but what is the status of the talks? Iran's foreign minister was saying there are no direct talks with the US, and this after we'd heard just a few days ago the indication from President Trump was that things were moving towards some kind of temporary agreement to get the strait. We were told the strait could be open, it was last Wednesday, wasn't it? And here we are, things haven't really moved forward. Not only have things not properly or substantially moved forward, there is still just as much confusion and uncertainty, arguably even more confusion and uncertainty because of the demands changing from the Iranian side this time.
It feels as though the Iranians are playing a clever game here, because what we're talking about here was an ADNOC-affiliated tanker that was under fire over the weekend. And don't forget, there is a lot of pressure coming from Middle East partners for some stability to return to the Middle East. They want to get on with business. So whether the attacks suggest that the UAE isn't in a safe place just yet, because, I mean, the narrative last week felt as though the real enemy here was really just the Americans. It didn't really extend to some of the partners, where there hasn't been as much of a pressure campaign in recent weeks. So I think that just adds to the complexity here about the position that those Middle East partners are in, the Middle East countries. And for the Americans here, and this is the line, I mean, when it comes to paying funds out to the Iranians, this would almost seem to be a red line that the US president has drawn. I mean, there's a whole heap of demands from the Iranian side, lifting the naval blockade, withdrawing forces for the Americans, end or sanctions. But here's the money part: free Iran's frozen assets, pay war reparations. I mean, pay war reparations. Does anyone from a Western lens think that the Americans are going to be keen to do that? Perhaps a sanctions negotiation here so the Iranians can sell oil into the international marketplace, but actually paying war reparations? I mean, that seems an incredibly challenging hurdle from an American perspective to get through.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's a negotiating tactic that you say, look, we've put our expectations and our requirements on the table. If you don't meet those, we have moved towards trying to resolve this. You have rejected it. It could be a whole part of their strategy. I think the other big development over the weekend that is really interesting is this pact between the Middle East nations, effectively a defensive pact that says, almost NATO style, an attack on one is to be regarded as an attack on all. What's not clear is what does that then trigger? What sort of mutual aligned response does that trigger? Because crucially, there is a nuclear-armed power within that pact in the form of Pakistan. There is also a NATO member in the form of Turkey. And what would happen then? Would that trigger some sort of chain reaction where if there were some attack on one of those in the pact, Turkey gets involved? Does that then de facto start to drag NATO in as well, because the obligations that NATO has to its fellow member Turkey? That is such a fascinating dynamic that has emerged over the weekend. Not a huge amount of detail in terms of how it would operate, but I think that really shifts, all the considerations and calculations that any strategists or generals may be making in that region right now.
But it also suggests that the region doesn't necessarily believe the Americans can solve this, that they're getting on the front foot and trying to push this story much quickly further forward. For me, it was the other points here too, that perhaps the Americans have given up on nuclear conversations, that perhaps that goal is just too lofty under this administration. There was some reporting suggesting that may be the case, and that the president may be happy with some of the bombing campaign, taking out the capabilities of nuclear in Iran in this presidency. So it was a fight for another day for another president down the track, which I thought was interesting, because now if we're just settling back on trying to fix the oil situation, and then it tells you just how challenging the situation really is for the Americans versus those original goals.
And one other element I throw in there is what happens now to the relationship between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, given the Israeli Prime Minister has rejected the plan for the Board of Peace to help with reconstruction in Gaza. What does that do when that Board of Peace was such a headline keystone policy announced with such fanfare, very much a pet project of the president's himself? I think that dynamic and how that plays out will be fascinating to watch as well. So where does all of this leave the price of oil? Well, unsurprisingly, it has been climbing in the session, but arguably not as sharply higher as you might imagine, given all of those elements that Karen and I were just discussing. But as we sit here on Monday morning, Brent crude at shy of $84 a barrel, WTI crude above $78 a barrel. So higher than where it was last week, but still below the $90 a barrel that we saw a couple of weeks ago, and well below the triple figures that we saw last month. So that is the state of play with the oil price. The Asian markets currently trading. This is the picture across the main benchmarks there. And it's been a slightly choppy picture for the Kospi in recent weeks. The same could be said for this session. It has fluctuated below and above the flat line, but currently in positive territory, up around 0.5%. The Nikkei 225 powering ahead, leading the gains higher, up almost 2% in the session. The Hang Seng and the Shanghai Composite also trading in the green this Monday. How does all of that set the tone for the European trading day? Well, we've not got a print from the Pan-European Blue Chip Stocks 50 or the DAX, so you have to make do with the FTSE futures, and those are pointing to a negative start to the session. We'll keep across that and track how that changes. Of course, we've got 50 minutes or so to the European market open. Slightly longer to wait until Wall Street trading gets underway. But this is the picture that's being called there, with the S&P 500 and the Nasdaq looking to build on the gains that both of the averages saw at the end of last week. The Dow looking to open below the flat line. We tend to see the Dow moving in a contrast step to the oil price. A lot of energy-heavy industries listed on that market. But worth saying, Wall Street comes off a stonking week. It had its best week since mid-April, with the S&P posting something like its 26th record close so far this year.
Yeah, it was a case of bad news is good news for the markets as the data rolled across, as the US economy unexpectedly lost 23,000 jobs in July. And the latest sign of a cooling labour market. Friday's non-farm payrolls fall report came as job gains for the previous 2 months were revised sharply lower. The unemployment rate also edged lower, coming in at 4.1% last month, while the participation rate dropped to just over 61%, its lowest level in more than 5 years. After the jobs report, the odds of a Fed rate hike fell, with markets now betting the central bank will continue to hold rates at its September meeting. According to CME's Fed Watch tool, the odds of a hold stand at 54%, with the chance of a 25 basis point hike at 46%. Modupe Adkebembo joins us, economist at Jefferies. Modupe, thank you very much for joining us. I was just commenting that we had softer data out Friday. Bad news is good news for markets that are now saying, well, what are the chances of a rate hike this year? What was your interpretation of that jobs report?
I think my interpretation of that jobs report was that it kind of hit the sweet spot for markets in a sense that, you know, as you mentioned, it seems like bad news from the face of it. When you're thinking about fears of the Fed hiking and also just where kind of markets sit at the moment, there are a lot of uncertainties. We do still have, of course, ongoing disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, uncertainty about where the US and Iran will land on that front. So I think actually markets took some solace in the fact that, you know, the jobs market wasn't necessarily overheating and maybe the Fed won't be forced to hike come September. So I think there are some good things to take from the print, but there's still a lot of uncertainties, I think, over the path going forward. Well,
we spent a lot of time talking about the situation in the Middle East as we kicked off the show, because it does feel important. If this continues on in the same vein, even if the president is happy if the gasoline price stays where it is, it still brings some further heat in terms of second-round effects to inflation in the US economy, just as we gear up this inflation report this week. What is the pressure that will come to bear if we do have this uncertainty and more elevated oil price for much longer?
Absolutely. And I think we'll see it start to come through not just in oil prices, but also in other goods. We've been talking about some of the impact on, you know, goods like ammonia, the impact that has on fertilizer, and some of these things will take months and months to feed through. So even though we might not be seeing the worst impacts coming through on gasoline at the moment, that might give some people some solace. I think the question about how long this price shock may last is something that I think we're going to continue to hear more and more about, because we might not see something where inflation will spike to, you know, double digits like we saw in 2022, but could it be something that persists over a longer time horizon? I think that's something that will continue to be a worry.
Modupe, I noticed as I was going through the oil price, out of the corner of my eye, I could see you nodding. I don't know if it's just reaction to the price, but it's when I was saying that we might have expected to see a sharper jump given all of this development over the weekend. Is that your feeling on it? What does the rise make sense to you, or is it something you'd have expected to see oil go higher on the back of?
So I think it's interesting because I think markets are confident from two things that we've seen, at least from the negotiations so far. The first thing is that between at least Iran and Oman, the negotiations are ongoing. So I think that's one positive that the markets take. But I think the second is the signalling so far from Donald Trump that he hasn't looked like he is set to escalate things further. So I think markets are still confident that we can get to some sort of agreement, even if it isn't. It may be a fudge, it may not be a great agreement, but it may be something that allows more oil and more things to flow through the Strait of Hormuz. So it won't be a perfect agreement, but I think markets are still comfortable that we might get there. But you can see from the oil price reaction, you know, things might be slightly delayed. I think if we see things remain as they are right now, I don't think we'll still see oil prices move in such a benign way over, you know, if this continues over the end of this week or into next week as well. So I think it's a time kind of sensitive reaction from the market. I think that makes sense, but there are still other things I think we need to see for it to be kind of realised as well.
I suppose the other risk potentially coming down the track is what happens with food price inflation. I was reading one bit of analysis that said it normally takes about 6 months before any impact on the production costs is felt or seen in the supermarket shelf pricing. Similarly, we've, on top of the disruption to fertiliser because of what's happening in Iran, the oil and gas price for transporting food goods having an impact on that. We've now also had extreme weather in Europe, could affect harvests, and and so many other factors. How much do you think the central banks will be looking at that, and how much do you think they'll be looking through it as standard fluctuations that will iron themselves out in due course?
Absolutely. So I think if we were to see these sorts of potential hits to food prices coming from a base of no inflation, I think most of the central banks would be quite confident in terms of looking through it. I think the challenge comes once you've already seen this increase in oil prices, this increase in energy prices that is already feeding through. We're already seeing some impacts on inflation. And then once you add in all of these impacts on food, I think it becomes more risky. When you look at some central banks, I think it's interesting that in the Bank of England, they talked about some studies that said that essentially some of these really, these goods that a lot of people buy and they're really focused on the prices of them when they go into the shops, they can have more of an impact on people's inflation expectations than some other goods. So I think it shows that some central banks are really, really worried about what we see in the food price kind of, in food price inflation and how that feeds through.
Right? Very much similar to the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Can I just peel across to Europe and what it means? Because we're also setting up for an ECB move potentially next month. Some of the market think we'll get a September hike, maybe another follow-up later this year. But you're also focused on the negative supply shock and the consequences to growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for the ECB, it does look quite likely that they're going to hike in September. And when we think about the fact that the disruptions are still going on in the Strait of Hormuz, I think that adds to the kind of hawkish expectations from the ECB. And they have been very, very focused on inflation. But we think that going forward, it's going to be quite challenging for the ECB to deliver more hikes. When you look at the kind of supply outlook, it's still quite negative. Growth in the Eurozone is, of course, holding up, but it isn't doing extremely well. And we still have other shocks that the Eurozone economy is facing. So I think that's a risk, and I think that's a reason that the ECB may not be able to go as far as they maybe would want to go. But I do think as well, when you're looking at the growth outlook, that makes them a bit more confident that once they've delivered these two hikes, the interest rates are in a better place, and actually some of the growth moderation as well will help to bring inflation back towards target. So they have those two things working for them as well.
OK, Modupe, thank you very much indeed for joining us this Monday morning, especially in August, when a lot of people are away. We appreciate you being here. Modupe Adegbembo, economist at Jefferies there. Do stay with us. Still to come on the show. Plenty more coming up, including this. Factory gate prices in China rise at a slower than expected pace as officials continue to fret over household spending. We'll break down the numbers for you. Plus, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejects President Trump's Gaza peace plan in a rare public split from his closest ally. And we'll discuss the impact for shipping with Peter Sand as Iran ties the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to a whole series of conditions.
I'm Steve Sedgwick from CNBC, and in my new podcast, Executive Decisions, I ask powerful leaders about their decisions that changed everything.
I'm not frightened of making tough decisions, and I think leadership can be very lonely.
Business leaders should not stay quiet in a world which is super complex.
It is absolutely fine to also change your mind.
Tough calls, personal crossroads. These are the stories that we can all learn from. It's Executive Decisions from CNBC. Get it wherever you get your podcasts.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected US President Donald Trump's peace plan for Gaza, raising issues over the timing of Israeli troops withdrawing from the enclave. The plan currently calls for a gradual removal whilst Hamas disarms. However, Netanyahu has said the militant group must fully lay down arms before troops will leave the Gaza Strip. The Israeli Prime Minister said conversations are underway with the US over the plan.
Israel
rejects the 15-point plan. The IDF will not carry out any withdrawal until Hamas is disarmed. And when I say disarming Hamas, it means the heavy weapons, the less heavy weapons, and the light weapons, all the weapons. And we are talking about real disarmament, not a fictitious disarmament. Now we are talking with the Americans about this issue. They have ideas, some of which are acceptable to us and some are not. We know how to stand up to these things, and we have proven it in the past, and we are proving it today as well. Additionally, the IDF will continue to thwart efforts against our forces and citizens, because once again, the existence of Israel and the security of all Israeli citizens is not up for negotiation. We stand firm on these interests.
Yemen's Houthis have claimed an attack on an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia shortly after Riyadh signed a mutual defence pact with Turkey and Pakistan amid rising regional instability. Saudi Arabia's energy ministry said a fire was extinguished at facilities belonging to Aramco in Jazan on Sunday. Well, Peter Sand, chief analyst at Zanetta, joins us now. Peter, just put into context for us in the bigger scheme of what's going on, how significant these attacks by the Houthi rebels are in terms of the status of the energy prices and getting oil and gas out of the region?
They are arguably much more relevant and interesting, so to speak, to follow than all the public speaking around Strait of Hormuz opening or closing that leads to no real world change. So if we focus on Bab el-Mandeb Strait, we have seen now for 2 weeks in a row shipping traffic through that narrow strait drop by 25%. So the fact that the Saudis and the Houthis are now fighting is definitely one of the things that has escalated the crisis in the Middle East from a shipping perspective in a negative direction in most recent weeks.
In terms of how clear a picture we have of the status of the flow of shipping through the region, through either of those routes, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait or the Strait of Hormuz, how accurate a picture do we have? How easy is it to get numbers and stats? Because at one point, a lot of ships, for their own security, were turning their transponders off.
Yeah. I mean, during times like war, the first casualty is often the truth, right? So what we at least try to do at Senator all the time is verify the sources from which we get our data, right? Because you get no real insights from either of the warmongering parties, right? So obviously we are aware of also ships that go cloaked, so to speak, that try to hide their transits. And but hey, in a wartime, it's not just enough to switch off your transponders. If you really want to do harm to any specific ship, depending on ownership or flag, then you can do so. So the real thing is basically to stay away if you are at threat in a crisis like this.
Peter, right throughout this crisis, companies have been trying to find alternative routes to ship product, and most of it has been a much longer route around the Cape of Good Hope, for instance. But the Chinese are going to chart course on a different route this week, the Ice Silk Road, which would effectively cut the 40-day shipping time from Asia to Europe in half. Extraordinary. It feels like it could be one of the biggest stories in the shipping industry this week as Sea Legend sets course from Ningbo to Felixstowe. What's your view on this and whether it's a sustainable option?
It's not a sustainable option. There are no real alternatives to the shipping routes that we have today. There are temporary workarounds that we have seen work their way, at least to mitigate some of the damage done to many of the crises that we see right now, mainly geopolitical one, but also health-related, weather-related, in and out. But there is no real alternative to the established routes now in a permanent way, at least not in the foreseeable future.
Peter, you're saying the melting of the ice hasn't changed the Arctic shipping routes in any significant way in your view at this stage?
That's correct. We count very few ships going up there. It may be that we will see from a container shipping perspective during a peak season like the one we got now, where there is actually a window of opportunity ranging from 3 to 4 months, maybe a few shipments may take place directly into North Europe. But you're not moving much cargo, and you cannot do that for the entirety of the year. And you need close relations to those that basically try still to claim authority over the route, the Russians.
Peter, as you talk about how this is a peak season, it does feel as though we're getting into that window now as we count down to Christmas, where key inventory needs to be shipped and then stored in various factories so it can be deployed for retailers for Christmas and the holiday season. Is that the window we're talking about here, and what are consequences if we continue to see this tightens through the Strait of Hormuz?
I think in Europe we're fully stocked up with containerized goods. Much of that also includes some of the stuff that we would actually see going into the peak season, which is normally the third quarter of the year, where the lion's share of consumerized consumer goods moved away from the factories in Asia into the consuming regions in North America and North Europe. So that kind of window of opportunity is basically due to the weather-related conditions up there. You need to have a fairly ice-free passage in order to go via the Northern Sea route, and that's the window of opportunity that I'm talking about here. Fortunately, being at the same time as the merchant peak season, so to speak. So let's see how much Sea Legend will do. Probably a few shipments, but in the bigger scheme of things, it won't change much.
Peter, how do you see the situation resolving given these latest twists and turns and the conditions being set by one side and another? What's your best guess? I hesitate to put any firmer word on it than a guess because it's very hard to see. But how do you see the Strait of Hormuz reopening and shipping getting back to anywhere near approaching normal?
I think still the more public talking we're getting, the less real world walking. So as long as we get the disputes left, right, and center in the media, from whether that's the American administration or the Iranians, whether it's Iran talking about a split of Strait of Hormuz with Oman, to me that sounds as if we're quite some distance away from what could be a return to safe and free passage in the Strait of Hormuz, which by all means should be the ambition for everyone involved in global shipping, right? But hey, we also know that stranger things have happened, but it should not be a revenue generating machine due to war damage, needed coverage or anything. The Strait of Hormuz is a key choke point, but also a key artery to ensure that energy is flowing to the entirety of the world and cash is flowing in the other direction, right? So you cannot put world trade into this ambush by having revenue raised in a later stage. But getting back to what may actually happen when things can return to the next normal. Tankers, bulkers, getting hydrocarbons and fertilizers out of the area will definitely resume their business as soon as they can do. Whereas container shipping, our expectations at Senate says clearly that we still need more than just a peace agreement or an affirmative before we can actually reset almost 100 services connecting the inner parts of the Arabian Gulf to the rest of the world. And that will take probably 2 to 4 months after we get affirmative confirmation that we're now able to once again transit the Strait of Hormuz free and safe.
Peter, just a final one. We've been talking a little bit this morning about this pact in the Middle East that was signed on Friday, the Mecca Joint Defence Agreement that effectively brings the Saudis, Turkey, Pakistan into a defence agreement where if there is a political attack or a geopolitical attack on one, that it does bring the others into play. It's interesting to me from the context that the shifting narrative of defence could go towards the Middle East, where they try and secure their own fortunes, their own geopolitical safety. But it also has the connotation where Pakistan has been one of the negotiators between the US and Iran with the situation in the Middle East, that it has now thrown its lot in with others in the region trying to push forward the agenda. If we do see alliances like this have more dominance, does that also impact the way we see shipping and how insurance companies may price the region around risk?
I think it's absolutely welcome to see regional forces stepping in to try and change what we have seen for decades in the region, right? From a shipping perspective, it's always been high-risk area for various reasons. We know multiple Gulf wars, right? So this latest move is definitely a welcome one, and the more parties we can actually get involved in peace talks and arrangement around elevated safety. In the end, probably that would also be a better situation for shipping and leaving, say, outside parties away from trying to do right when it should be solved in a local and regional manner. So definitely a positive move, but hey, we need probably to see more than that, and we need to get more details out of it before we can actually conclude that this is entirely positive.